CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor with Mark Piesing. His new book is N-4 Down, The Hunt for the Arctic Airship Italia. It is now 1928. Our hero, our protagonist from Italy, Umberto Nobile, has put together another expedition to the North Pole, this one to top everything, to land at the North Pole, perhaps to circumnavigate the Arctic. He's got a new airship this time, which he's dubbed the Italia. It's no longer sharing with Norway. Mark, what is important about the design of the Italia for the Arctic?
Well, I suppose it's almost exactly the same as the N1, I guess, and I suppose the N1 is a proven design, and the N4 is almost exactly the same. I suppose it's a bit more designed for the Arctic outright. So again, the emphasis is on lightweight. Making sure everything's still protected, trying to learn the lessons from the earlier flight. So it's a very similar aircraft, and that's part of the problem because when nobody decided to go, he wanted to go to the North Pole, which is almost that moment when he landed in Alaska. He decided to go back, which is not surprising in a way because the North Pole exerts this amazing effect on people. I mean, I went up to Svalbard to research my book, and I just want to go back. I mean, it burrows into your soul in some strange way. So he had this obsession, but his idea was to go back in a much bigger airship, much more like the ones that his rival, Hugo Echner was building.
The Zeppelin airships of Germany. Echner had inherited Zeppelin's fleet, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So he wanted to have a much bigger airship, so it'd be more stable. You'd be able to carry out more scientific research. And these things always have science as a kind of fig leaf or the, and you could argue how valuable any of the science was. But he made, and the airship was going to originally fly from Rome to, Buenos Aires or Rio, to kind of do a similar trip, just to build up Italian propaganda for Mussolini. Then he was going to repurpose it for this kind of Arctic flight. But he made one fatal mistake. He went to Japan immediately afterwards because the Japanese had brought one of his airships. So he went there to train their crew, I guess to get worshipped, to gain, all the adulation of the crowds in Japan. He was seen as a hero. He was on the cover of textbooks and things like this. But when he was there, Italio Balbo, who we mentioned briefly, had become the head of the Air Force, and he didn't like airships. He saw they were the past, and he didn't like Nobile. So he used Nobile's absence to destroy this large Zeppelin-like airship, totally destroyed, melted it down. And so there's no way that when nobody got back, he could kind of resume this project. So he had to go back to the Arctic in this smaller airship, although it's still the size of the A380, but relatively small.
So the airship that Nobile was building was not available to him. He had to go back to the original design. So N1 and N4 are the same airships. Is that correct?
Very similar, very similar.
He makes a dash to Berlin in March of 1928 to meet Rudolf Semyonovich. Who is that?
Well, he was the head of, he was one of the most veteran Soviet explorers, I suppose, going back into Tsarist explorers. He's the head of an institute in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, I think it was called by then, into kind of polar research. So he had access to all the research the Russians and Soviets had done, which obviously hadn't been translated into German, Italian, or English. And he's an expert on those areas.
So let me set this up now. Our hero, our protagonist, Nobile, has enemies in Italy. One of them is head of the Italian Air Force, Italo Balbo. Yeah. He has rivals everywhere. However, at the same time, he's admired by the Soviet Union. Yeah. He's worshipped by Italy. And he's suspect to Norway and to the north, where he's headed, because he has to launch from the northernmost port in Norway. Amundsen is not invited. What is Amundsen's opinion of Nobile now in the spring of 28?
Well, he writes this book called My Life as an Explorer, which is the kind of book that he shouldn't have been allowed to publish. His publicist should have said no, in which he I suppose he's this kind of, you have to think that he's out in this kind of villa, his house, on this fjord. He's withdrawn into himself. I think increasingly, I suppose we would say he would have mental health issues. He's probably very depressed. his big triumph has been taken over by a young upstart Italian. So he writes this book, not just about the flight of the Norge, but about all his expeditions. And he attacks everyone. He attacks so many people, but especially nobly. I mean, he really goes for him. So Amundsen detests nobly, sees him as the enemy. So they're really falling out with each other.
The preparation for this expedition includes an Italian rescue ship commanded by a man named Captain Romagna, Cite, we'll call it, the Cite of Milan, the city of Milan.
Yeah.
What do we need to know about Romagna? He's a suspicious character, but who's he working for?
Well, this is a good question. I think I started off when I was writing this book really seeing him through nobody's eyes as this kind of stooge for the fascists, and that basically his job was to sabotage his expedition, because Balbo famously said to Mussolini, let nobody go back to the Arctic because he can't possibly come back to bother us. So there's a sense of, let him go and he'll die a martyr and we've got rid of him. So nobody certainly saw Romagna, and some of nobody's friends and fans saw him in this way. But there's also another story. I mean, he's a Navy officer. He wants a career. He's working in the Navy, and like nobly, it's a difficult time, isn't it? Balbo, Mussolini are in charge. He has a life. He has to make choices. He's probably also quite a conservative character. And he was right about some of the warnings about the limitations of the Italians operating in these conditions, because his ship isn't particularly designed for the Arctic. Some of the men aren't. Some of the soldiers they had, special forces, were trained for the mountains, but not necessarily the Arctic. So I think you can see him in many different ways, but it's fair to say that history hasn't necessarily been kind to him.
Yes, when you press into this story you've written, Mark, there are huge questions that haven't been answered in all these 90 years, and we're still searching for motivation. All right, one more ship coming to the attention of this expedition, the Krasin of the Soviets. What is that?
Well, this is a huge, powerful pre-First World War icebreaker, which I think was built in Britain. It's a very powerful ship. It had been laid up in Leningrad for, I can't remember now, I think it was about maybe a year. The crew had all been broken up, kind of moved away. And what they were realizing was that there's a big divide when they're trying to work out how to rescue these guys. One is by aviation, by planes. One is by airships. But there weren't any really around at that stage. I mean, the Graf Zeppelin was a possibility, but Hugo Egner, was trying had offered it, but it wasn't quite ready. And perhaps you could argue the British could have offered some airships, but the British refused to be involved in any of these activities. Very Brexit, as a British person, you can't help see some of these things in that event. The British refused to be involved. And so one of the main other options is to get there by ship. Now, no ship as big as the Krasin had ever broken that far through the sea ice. So it was a risk. But the Soviets, a bit like Mussolini, Stalin's, agenda was the same. It was propaganda. What better outcome would be if a Soviet icebreaker rescued the fascists?
Now, remember, all of this is anticipation of a disaster. Nothing's happened yet, but we're going to crash the ship very quickly. It's the middle of May. They take off, and they reach the North Pole. My time says at 2:20 a.m. No, at 12:24 a.m., May 24th, they fly over the North Pole. And I like this detail, Mark. They have a gramophone on board, for heaven's sakes. And while they circle the North Pole, they play a fascist hymn, and I guess they all sing. It's a strange detail. However, they've now circled the North Pole, and they're heading back. Suddenly, loud cracks start sounding. And they are now struggling with a fog bank. What's happening to the ship? What are the cracks?
Well, the cracks are ice smashing into the frame, into the gondola. It's the sound of the kind of structure. These are really powerful winds they're encountering, kind of twisting, being subjected to forces that perhaps they didn't quite understand. So the whole ship is really struggling in this kind of fierce fog wind, terrible wind.
There are 16 men on board.
Yeah.
Some of them are asleep in the balloon itself. Some of them are on duty and sleepless in the gondola where Nobile is. At around 10:20 a.m. on the 24th, we have Mark quoting one of the survivors, "We are heavy. The control cabin and the rear engine, they're sinking.
Yeah.
Smash into the ice." What happens to the ship, Mark, once they smash?
Well, this is horrific, because the airship doesn't really crash. What happens is it smashes into the ice tail first. The gondola gets crushed and stays on the ice. Two of the engines get knocked off, and then the rest of the airship actually floats away, this time under no kind of control. Nobody kind of recovers consciousness from the crash, opens his eyes and sees the big Italia on the side floating away into distance. And in the hull, there were the 6 men who are still in the envelope, looking down on the people on the ice. It must have been utterly horrific. And the survivors describe seeing their faces change as they realize their fate, the fate that awaits them.
Right, they were never seen again. One of them, though, Ettore Arduino, an engineer, does a very brave thing. He throws over fuel, food, a tent, pistol, and a portable radio to the men on the ice. That saves their lives.
Absolutely. Otherwise, they would have died from exposure very quickly.
All right. Of the 16 men on board, 6 are now gone and never seen again.
Yeah.
10 are on the ice in various damage. And when we come back, the rescue effort that was anticipated is now underway. Mark Piesing is the author. N-4 Down is the book. The Hunt for the Arctic Airship Italia. We're about to join the whole world in the hunt.